Anybody who's looking at this carefully realizes that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science. I represent science.
Anyone who looks carefully at the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic will indeed find an anti-science flavor to it. But that antipathy towards science didn't come from the government's critics. It came from Dr. Anthony Fauci, who consistently contradicted himself, concealed information, and often told outright lies.
You said there was pushback.
Yeah.
Where did that pushback come from?
No, it wasn't. That was the wrong choice of words.
As 15 Days to Slow the Spread enters into its third year, it's easy to forget that the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was not always one of caution and fear. In the early days of the epidemic, many politicians, particularly politicians in the Democrat Party, threw caution to the wind.
The American people need to have a president who is going to act rationally about it.
But we do want to say to people, come to Chinatown. Here we are.
These glib dismissals of the threat posed by the novel coronavirus leaking out of China were not merely being spouted by uninformed politicians. They were also the official position of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's leading infectious disease official. Although Dr. Fauci would go on to become the leading voice for alarm amid the pandemic, in the early days of COVID, Dr. Fauci downplayed the threat.
Bottom line, we don't have to worry about this one, right?
This is not a major threat for the people in the United States, and this is not something that the citizens of the United States right now should be worried about.
Clear as day. But then, a month later, something strange happened.
There should be universal wearing of masks. There should be, to the extent possible, social distancing, avoiding crowds. Outdoors always better than indoors, and being a
From his
situation
perch at the helm of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Fauci had amassed a great deal of prestige and influence over the years. In 2008, President George Bush awarded Dr. Fauci the Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. From 1983 to 2002, Fauci was the 13th most cited scientist in the world, across all disciplines, among nearly 3 million authors, according to the Institute for Scientific Information. When Fauci spoke, people listened.
The confines of transmissibility now going to be loosening up and broadening up.
In essence, AIDS is a difficult disease to catch.
You can't isolate yourself from the rest of the world for the whole flu season.
I would like to see a dramatic diminution of the personal interaction that we see. Whatever it takes to do that, that's what I'd like to see.
We will do what the establishment media have refused to do. We will give you an unvarnished look at the career of the most powerful politician in America. This man didn't amass all this power overnight. He had several test runs over the decades. The best scientists do not become administrators. The best scientists stay in the labs. That's the conclusion that author Bruce Nussbaum came to in his 1990 study of the federal government's failure to effectively fight the AIDS epidemic. Nussbaum's criticism applied to the entire government-run public health apparatus. But he was referring to one bureaucrat in particular.
What I'd like to do is discuss with you a topic which I'm sure all of you are aware of. And that is the subject of the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, because it really is one of the only subjects where you really have to change your lecture every month.
Dr. Anthony Fauci may have been, in Bruce Nussbaum's words, a lackluster scientist, but he has always been a masterful politician who first came to public prominence in 1984 when he took over the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Fauci's true vocation, the author observed, was not science, but empire building. Fauci had risen to the helm of the NIAID, just 3 years after doctors first noticed a deadly illness spreading among homosexual men in New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco.
To isolate this, as you see here, the causative agent of AIDS.
Just last year, Fauci told a reporter from The Guardian, "My career and my identity has really been defined by HIV." The American people first got to know Dr. Fauci as the government's public face on the AIDS epidemic.
Cover story tonight, we'll talk with a leading scientist about his work in AIDS research.
His fame from that period helped to justify his outsized influence over the government's COVID response 4 decades later. Larry Kramer, co-founder of the Gay Men's Health Crisis, observed that in order to make an appointment with Dr. Fauci, one did not call his secretary or his personal assistant, but rather his press officers, quote, who book talks and interviews like movie stars. Much like today, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, the most dangerous place in America was the space between Dr. Fauci and a TV camera.
It gives me a great deal of pleasure and excitement to talk about AIDS.
As HIV and AIDS spread around the country, there were 2 distinct ways to fight the epidemic: vaccines or therapeutic treatment. With limited resources, the federal government could either focus on drugs that would suppress the virus and transform it from a terminal illness into a chronic disease, or focus on finding a vaccine that would prevent you from contracting the virus in the first place. Fauci, an immunologist by training, took the vaccine approach.
Dr. Anthony Fauci is hopeful that the answer to this dreaded disease may be in sight.
I believe now that we have the agent in hand, that the amount of effort and energy that's being put into it by biomedical sciences, that within a reasonable period of time we'll have a lot of these answers.
Well, it's certainly nice to know that the future looks brighter.
It's been nearly 4 decades since Fauci first started searching for a vaccine, and we still don't have one. Nevertheless, AIDS has gone from a death sentence to a perfectly manageable illness. But that happy turn of events did not happen because of Dr. Fauci. If anything, the United States got AIDS under control in spite of him. By 1987, more than 1 million Americans had been infected by HIV, and yet the government had failed to produce a single drug treatment. As Nussbaum noted in 1990, Fauci barely survived, and even then only by handing over control of the government's only AIDS drug trial program to a pharmaceutical company.
Dr. Tony Fauci, director of the National...
Guys like Fauci get up there and start talking, he doesn't know anything really about anything, and I'd say that to his face. Nothing.
During the first few years of Fauci's tenure at the helm of NIAID, the public health guru had spent $374 million on AIDS treatment research, with little, if anything, to show for it. Larry Kramer berated him as an incompetent idiot who had established only a system of waste, chaos, and uselessness. Thanks to help from the private sector, the government finally came out with a single drug, azithromycin, or AZT, to treat the illness. The FDA approved the drug on March 19, 1987. It was heralded as a breakthrough and the light at the end of the tunnel. And the agency approved it faster than any other drug up until that point in U.S. history. And the drug came with a hefty price tag, roughly $8,000 per patient per year, $17,000 inflation adjusted. Still, who can put a price on one's own life? If it worked, it was worth it. And AZT did seem to work, at least at first. The patients taking it soon began to show increasing levels of the virus. Actually, they began to show increasing levels of a new, more virulent virus, which had mutated to resist the drug. More troubling still, the drug itself was extremely toxic. Yet despite warnings that AZT should only be used as a last-ditch effort to save AIDS patients on the brink of death, Dr. Fauci pushed to expand prescription. In 1989, the government announced that a full 1.4 million Americans living with HIV, even those without any symptoms, could benefit from taking the drug. Fauci claimed that 2 years of studies had clearly shown that early use of AZT would help to keep AIDS at bay. But Spin magazine, which had taken particular interest in the government's work on AIDS, and in Anthony Fauci in particular, couldn't seem to track down a copy of the much-touted study. In fact, when Spin requested the data from the NIH, the government scientists told them that the study was still being written. In the case of AZT's effectiveness, the government had been relying on some questionable numbers. Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, who died in January of 2021, was a major AIDS researcher from the earliest days of the epidemic. In fact, he was one of the first physicians to notice the disease among his gay male patients, and Dr. Fauci himself described Sonnabend as one of the true soldiers in the war against HIV, a model for a real translation of care to the patient. And Dr. Sonnabend vigorously criticized the government's approach to AZT under Fauci's leadership. It's terribly dishonest the way they portrayed those numbers, Sonnabend believed. Worse still, AIDS patients, including those showing few, if any, symptoms, had for years been prescribed high doses of the toxic drug. Some activists even suggested prescribing it to uninfected people if they happened to be at risk. A French study published in The Lancet in December of 1988 found that AZT was too toxic for most people, had no lasting effect on HIV levels in the blood, and left patients with fewer T4 cells than they had started with. Gene Fedorko, the president of Health Education AIDS Liaison, considered the government's support for mass prescription madness. "I am absolutely convinced," he said, "that people enjoy a better quality of life and survive longer who do not take AZT. I think it's horrible the way people are bullied by their doctors to take this drug. We get people coming to us shaking and crying because their doctors said they'll die if they don't take AZT. That is an absolute lie." Prominent AIDS activist Michael Callan put it in more personal terms. "I wouldn't take AZT if you paid me. I've gotten the SHIT kicked out of me for saying this, but I think using AZT is like aiming a thermonuclear warhead at a mosquito." In May of 1983, in an editorial alongside a peer-reviewed article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Dr. Fauci suggested that routine close contact, as within a family household, can spread the disease, hypothesizing, if indeed the latter is true, then AIDS takes on an entirely new dimension.
As we're seeing virtually as the months go by, other groups that can be involved, and seeing it in children is really quite disturbing.
When you say other close contact, give me some examples.
Well, for example, if the close contact of a child is a household contact, perhaps there will be a certain number of cases of individuals who are just living with and in close contact with someone with AIDS or at risk of AIDS, who does not necessarily have to have intimate sexual contact or share a needle, but just the ordinary close contact that one sees.
With hindsight, we know that Fauci's suggestion was not true. He went on to admit this himself the following year, in another peer-reviewed journal, the Annals of Internal Medicine. "There is no evidence," Fauci then wrote, "that the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome can be transmitted by routine household or social contact." So where had he gotten the idea in the first place? Fauci has never said, because no such evidence existed, as the Journal of the American Medical Association tacitly admitted by publishing a letter from two physicians after Fauci had made the first claim. "It is too early," the doctors wrote, "to suggest that AIDS is acquired by household contact without substantial evidence to support such a claim." It was indeed too early for responsible scientists, but it was not too early for Dr. Fauci, who made the implausible and sensationalist claim that our experience suggests that children living in high-risk households are susceptible to AIDS, and that sexual contact, drug abuse, or exposure to blood products is not necessary for disease transmission. As would be his habit decades later, Dr. Fauci rushed to the press, took both sides of the issue with enough speculative language to give him cover later on, and never apologized for getting it wrong. As would happen decades later, the press rushed to print whatever unsubstantiated sensationalism dripped from Fauci's lips. Household contacts can transmit AIDS, one nationally syndicated report read in May of 1983. Does AIDS spread by routine contact? Asked the Associated Press, quoting Fauci. Even the New York Times raised the question of household transmission, relying on Fauci's expertise. When other public health authorities, including President Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler, suggested that there was no evidence that the general population was threatened by AIDS, few people believed her. Even conservative stalwart Pat Buchanan turned on Reagan's health secretary, quoting Dr. Fauci's editorial as evidence in a column that was entered into the congressional record. In Buchanan's defense, he was quoting the man everyone believed to be the nation's foremost expert on the virus. It just happened to be the case that the expert, who seemed so confident, was totally wrong. Now, Fauci had already begun to walk back his claims in June of 1983, less than 2 months after his JAMA article. It is absolutely preposterous to suggest that AIDS can be contracted through normal social contact, like being in the same room with someone or sitting on a bus with them, he told the Baltimore Sun. The poor gays have received a very raw deal on this. Fauci maintained that children could spread the virus in ordinary household interactions. He defended the poor gays, but not the poor children. Just as we would see decades later during his handling of the COVID epidemic, Dr. Fauci tailored his medical statements to political considerations. One of the most disconcerting aspects of the government's efforts to fight AIDS involved children, specifically foster children, enlisted in drug trials funded by the NIH and Fauci's NIAID. Investigations that took place decades later discovered that the children enrolled in these studies often were not afforded a personal health advocate during the trials. The children suffered painful side effects from the experiments, including rashes, vomiting, and sharp drops in infection-fighting blood cells. In one study, at least 10 children died, 4 from blood poisoning. According to authorities at the time, the deaths did not appear directly attributable to the drug that was being tested, but were nonetheless disturbing. To this day, researchers have not explained why overall mortality among children receiving that drug in the trial was significantly higher. More shocking than any of these particular scandals, the misplaced priorities, the reckless press declarations, even the experimentation on wards of the state, is the way in which Fauci has survived all of these episodes unscathed. Fauci's uncanny ability to flit from failure to failure, with the public none the wiser, would reach its apex in the years after the AIDS crisis had died down, when Dr. Fauci would set the stage for the global coronavirus pandemic that he would come to take credit for curing. Dr. Fauci has been in power for a long, long time. How much longer can he cling to power?
Welcome.
Good to be here.
We hear from a physician in Durham, North Carolina. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Fauci. You've been at the NIH a pretty long time, and it seems to me that during your tenure, our ability to control infectious diseases hasn't improved, but in fact worsened. Don't you think it's time that you step down and let someone else who has a more effective message?
Actually, no.
Fauci is all about Fauci. He loves being the headline. It's his ego. Those are the words of Jonathan Fishbein, a medical safety expert and NIH whistleblower who nearly lost his career for exposing government and scientific misconduct on Dr. Anthony Fauci's watch. According to journalist Celia Farber, who has covered Dr. Fauci and NIAID since the 1980s, Fishbein's big problem is that he thought his job was legit. Fishbein took medical ethics seriously. But, according to Farber, his personal virtues were all fatal character flaws within the NIAID institutional culture.
I'm concerned about a lack of compliance on the part of many investigators, and I'm concerned about the lack of oversight from the federal government, particularly the NIH, in making sure that rules are followed.
In 2004, officials at the Division of AIDS strategized on how to fire Fishbein without any political blowback for the man at the top, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Edmund Tremont, the chief of the division, ordered a colleague to figure out how to oust the troublesome Fishbein. Tony will not want anything to come back on us, Tremont warned. So we are going to have ironclad documentation, no sense of harassment or unfairness, and, like other personnel actions, this is going to take some work. Unfortunately for Fauci, Fishbein's firing did not sit well with the public and their elected representatives. Calls soon began to mount for an investigation. The NIH reacted to this outcry by insisting that Fishbein had been fired for poor job performance. But that excuse fell flat when it came to light that the Institute had recommended that he receive a cash performance bonus just weeks before his firing. After a protracted legal battle and 2 years of federal and congressional investigations, the NIH finally backtracked and reinstated Fishbein. We've seen a lot of government and scientific misconduct firsthand over the past 2 years. Flip-flops, false promises, outright lies, and cover-ups. 2 years into 15 Days to Slow the Spread, we still don't have solid answers to the most basic questions about the pandemic. Simple questions like, do the face masks actually protect people? How exactly do the vaccines work? Why are we still living according to the diktats of a handful of public health officials, and really just one bureaucrat in particular, Dr. Anthony Fauci? Unfortunately, during his 4-decade reign in public health policy, Dr. Fauci has proven himself to be a master of obfuscation, of avoiding difficult questions. Investigations into Dr. Fauci's competence and ethics have frequently gone nowhere. And on the rare occasions when a whistleblower has looked a little too closely into Fauci's affairs, the powerful bureaucrat has managed to send such troublesome people packing.
The confines of transmissibility now going to be loosening up and broadening up.
In essence, AIDS is a difficult disease to catch.
You can't isolate yourself from the rest of the world for the whole flu season.
I would like to see a dramatic diminution of the personal interaction that we see. Whatever it takes to do that, that's what I'd like to see.
For decades, scandal has been not the exception, but the rule at Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. In 1991, the Office of Government Ethics investigated Dr. Fauci's NIAID for ethical violations pertaining to government employees moonlighting in private industry without proper oversight. The investigation concluded that some activities appeared to be approved without adequate documentation. And Fauci's malfeasance extended far beyond America's national borders. In January 2002, after the FDA had threatened to send inspectors to investigate reports of ethical violations in an AIDS study conducted by NIAID in Uganda, the German pharmaceutical giant Boehringer Ingelheim sent its own investigators with a promise to share the findings with the agency. Boehringer concluded that Fauci's study was in serious non-compliance with FDA regulations. including failure to disclose serious risks to the study participants.
So here's me, it's a dark, you can't see it, making rounds in a hospital in Kampala. These African doctors were me in 1981.
In an effort to stave off a formal FDA investigation, Fauci's NIAID hired a private consulting group, Westat, to compile their own report on the study. But Westat's conclusions were just as damning as Boehringer's. In some ways, they were worse. The inspectors uncovered a loss of critical records at the Kampala study site, including a ledger that had logged the injuries and deaths suffered by study participants. A couple of years later, in 2004, an internal NIH review described Fauci's AIDS research team as managers who seemed unaware of the need for appropriate behavior, decorum, and enforcement of good management practices and rules of supervision. In 2005, an Associated Press review discovered that Fauci's agency had funded research that tested AIDS drugs on hundreds of foster children. At least 10 children died, and while the researchers refused to attribute the deaths directly to the drug they were testing, they had to admit that overall mortality while receiving the study drug was significantly higher, and that this finding remains unexplained. While such unexplained deaths, and missing records about those deaths, raise troubling questions about Dr. Fauci's ethics and leadership, most of the scandals that have occurred on the celebrity bureaucrat's watch revolve around a more prosaic subject: cold, hard cash.
There are going to be resources that are going to have to be forthcoming to be able to implement the kinds of things that I think are going to be needed.
In 2003, Dr. Fauci redirected $117 million away from infectious disease research toward the development of a new anthrax vaccine. The following year, Fauci directed a whopping $5.6 billion appropriation for bioterrorism research as part of Project BioShield, which was, at that time, the largest single-issue spend in NIH history.
Project BioShield is a three-pronged program. It increases the authorities and flexibilities of the NIH to expedite research. It establishes a secure funding source to purchase countermeasures, and it establishes an FDA emergency use authorization.
Still, despite all those billions of dollars, 4 years later, the government pulled the plug on the project. Fauci had failed to develop a new anthrax vaccine, and later even echoed the concerns of his critics, who believed the project was a waste of money that directed attention away from other more urgent threats to the public. At the end of the day, Fauci finally admitted, "You're not going to kill as many people in an anthrax attack as you would if you blasted off a couple of car bombs in Times Square."
If you put your money with smallpox vaccine, this vaccine, that vaccine, while you're doing that, you should be pushing for something that's more broad. And that gets under the category of the basic research as well as the applied.
Spending money is how government bureaucrats protect their power and positions. In business, a CEO might be rewarded for saving money on fruitless endeavors and reinvesting those funds in more profitable enterprises. In administrative government, saving money just means you get your budget cut. So after Fauci's failure to develop a vaccine to fight AIDS, and after his failure to develop a new vaccine to fight anthrax, the politically savvy bureaucrats spent the following decade promoting wild goose chase after wild goose chase to further enhance his influence and power. In 2005, Dr. Fauci warned the world of an imminent, devastating bird flu pandemic.
So when you have what's going on in Southeast Asia, there's still the potential for there being a very serious public health catastrophe. How can you respond to the worst case scenario? So I think that's what you're seeing right now.
Most public health experts agree, Fauci wrote in a paper, that it is only a matter of time before another catastrophic influenza epidemic occurs, and it certainly will occur in the 21st century. This imminent threat, it seemed, required more urgent funding for Dr. Fauci. And the dreaded bird flu did arrive that very year. But the results were not quite so dire as Dr. Fauci had predicted. By May of 2006, the World Health Organization estimated that the bird flu had killed just 100 people worldwide. Good news for the world, bad news for Fauci's credibility. A few years later, in 2009, Fauci's infectious disease team again began to warn of a new, devastating pandemic, this time caused by swine flu. This type of flu can be very, very dangerous, especially to young people. And diagnoses began to skyrocket.
Colleges all across the country are starting to take some extraordinary precautions.
Sensational headlines began to appear in print about hundreds of college students at a single university coming down with the flu at the same time. But in October of that year, CBS investigative journalist Cheryl Atkinson made a startling discovery.
If you've been diagnosed with probable or presumed 2009 H1N1 or swine flu in recent months, you may be surprised to know this. The odds are you didn't have H1N1 flu. In fact, you probably didn't have flu at all.
Despite the pandemics allegedly raging around the country, in late July of 2009, American public health officials stopped counting individual cases. CBS filed a Freedom of Information request to try to figure out why the public health bureaucracy had shut down testing.
They wouldn't answer Freedom of Information requests that we filed. They wouldn't answer questions that we posed to them. And we approached Dr. Frieden, who heads CDC, at an unrelated news conference to confront him about this lack of information.
What can we do to get that information released to us? Your office has stopped communicating with us.
I am aware of the issue. Once we are comfortable in that, we will be happy to release it to you. I do not know whether that will be today or not.
While waiting for those numbers, Atkinson contacted all 50 states, asking for their state lab-confirmed swine flu tests. She discovered that most cases turned out to be negative. All this meant, in Atkinson's words, that with most cases diagnosed solely on symptoms and risk factors, the H1N1 flu epidemic may seem worse than it is. Wolfgang Wodarg, a German physician and politician who served as chairman of the Health Committee at the Council of Europe, went so far as to accuse public health officials and pharmaceutical companies of exaggerating the risks of the pandemic in order to sell vaccines, calling the response one of the greatest medicine scandals of the century. Again, the lower than expected death count was good news for the world, bad news for the credibility of public health officials, particularly of those in charge of infectious disease policy. 7 years later, in 2016, Dr. Fauci found a new pandemic to worry about. An outbreak of Zika virus, discovered in Brazil, allegedly threatened to explode in the United States, causing, among other things, devastating birth defects in the babies of infected pregnant women. While Dr. Fauci waited for Congress to give him hundreds of millions of dollars to research Zika, the nation's leading infectious disease official announced that he would divert funds from malaria, influenza, and tuberculosis research to develop a Zika vaccine. Fortunately, the great Zika virus threat never really materialized in the United States, which is a very good thing, because a 2017 report from the Government Accountability Office found that the U.S. public health system was unprepared on virtually every front, lacking a reliable record of case numbers and a clear understanding of how the virus transmitted from mothers to children. The measurement of any public health official's effectiveness is public health. Do people get sicker or healthier on a leader's watch? The proof of the pudding is in the tasting. Unfortunately, under the leadership of Dr. Fauci, the public health problems that it has been his job to fix have only gotten worse. Fear-mongering, financial mismanagement, failed predictions, few positive health results, and even fewer consequences have been Dr. Fauci's modus operandi for decades. So how has he skirted responsibility for such a steady record of failure? Some of it probably has to do with Fauci's knack for political maneuvering. Some of it might have to do with his eagerness and ability to communicate directly with the public through any media platform that will have him. And some of it might just have to do with Dr. Fauci's willingness to do just about anything to maintain power, even when that means lying to Congress. On May 12th, 2021. Well over a year into the COVID-19 pandemic that had led politicians effectively to shut down the world, Senator Rand Paul accused Dr. Fauci of funding the same type of research thought to have caused the pandemic, at the very same institute from which the virus is thought to have escaped. That type of research is called gain-of-function research, and it involves giving an organism a new property or enhancing an existing property. In layman's terms, it means beefing up something that already exists in nature, a virus, for instance, to make it more potent, perhaps more deadly, perhaps more transmissible to humans. Sounds dangerous, and it is. So dangerous, in fact, that the US government placed a moratorium on the research in 2014, a ban that was eventually lifted just 2 years before the COVID-19 pandemic shut down the world. Dr. Fauci denied any wrongdoing.
Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding
Senator
of
Paul,
the lab
with all
in
due
Wuhan?
respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect. The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function
Government
research.
scientists like yourself who favor gain-of-function research.
I don't favor gain-of-function research in China. You are saying things that are not correct.
Dr. Fauci's denial turned out to be a lie. As documents obtained by The Intercept through a Freedom of Information request demonstrate, the NIH did in fact support the research. Not only had it supported the research, but it supported the research in Wuhan, where COVID-19 began. On May 27, 2014, Dr. Fauci awarded a grant of $666,000 for the study of bat coronaviruses, research which involved gain-of-function, at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The grant was for a project that extended from 2014 through 2019, despite the gain-of-function moratorium from 2014 through 2017. In the words of Richard Ebright, professor of chemistry and chemical biology at Rutgers University, the documents make it clear that assertions by the NIH director, Francis Collins, and the NIAID director, Anthony Fauci, that the NIH did not support gain-of-function research are untruthful. The NIH attempted to exculpate itself by redefining the term gain-of-function itself, arguing that only research conducted with the explicit intent to make organisms more virulent falls within that category.
Gain-of-function meaning taking a virus that could infect humans and making it either more transmissible and or pathogenic to humans.
Not only was Fauci's claim before Congress a lie, it was also incoherent. First, he denied that Dr. Ralph Barrick, a leading gain-of-function researcher, had engaged in gain-of-function research. Then, in the same breath, he argued that the gain-of-function research that Dr. Barrick had engaged in was perfectly fine and took place in North Carolina, not Wuhan, China. In reality, neither contention was true. Dr. Barrick had partnered closely with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, specifically with Dr. Shi Zhengli, the director of the Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases at the Wuhan Institute. The two published a paper together about their research titled, "A SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence." The research, which began before the government's moratorium on gain-of-function research, renewed debate over the risky technique, as even Dr. Barrick admitted in his paper. The potential to prepare for and mitigate future outbreaks must be weighed against the risk of creating more dangerous pathogens.
We had a big scare with SARS-CoV-1 back in 2002, 2003. That particular virus unquestionably went from a bat to an intermediate host to start an epidemic and a pandemic that resulted in 8,000 cases and close to 800 deaths.
Fauci himself understood the immense risks posed by this kind of research, and therefore, he was willing to gamble with the public health, as he explained in an article in 2012. In an unlikely but conceivable turn of events, what if that scientist becomes infected with the virus, which leads to an outbreak and ultimately triggers a pandemic? Scientists working in this field might say, as indeed I have said, that the benefits of such experiments and the resulting knowledge outweigh the risks. Within the research community, many have expressed concern that important research progress could come to a halt just because of the fear that someone somewhere might attempt to replicate these experiments sloppily. This is a valid concern. A valid concern, but the potential benefits outweigh the risks. So Fauci funded the research. And not only did Fauci fund this risky research, despite his testimony to the contrary, but the NIH also funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
You've got to go where the action is. So I often say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, you don't want to study bats in Fairfax County, Virginia, to find out what the animal-human interface is that might lead to a jumping of species. So we had a modest collaboration with very respectable Chinese scientists who are world experts on coronavirus.
So in case you lost track, Dr. Fauci first said he didn't fund this kind of research. Then it came out that he did. Then he insinuated that he hadn't funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Then it came out that he did. Then finally, he insisted that the funds sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology had not been used for gain-of-function research. Can you guess what happened next? In a letter to Congressman James Comer on October 20th, 2021, the NIH admitted that it had in fact funded gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The NIH blamed its previous denial just 3 months earlier on EcoHealth Alliance, the nonprofit through which it had funded the Wuhan Institute. According to the NIH, EcoHealth President Peter Daszak had failed to report the gain of function. But, NIH went on, the public health authorities were confident that this research on bat coronaviruses at the institute where the pandemic began could not in any way have led to the pandemic. In 2018, Peter Daszak and EcoHealth applied to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA, for a $14 million grant to partner with the Wuhan Institute and construct SARS-related bat coronaviruses into which they could insert human-specific cleavage sites to evaluate growth potential of the pathogens. DARPA rejected the proposal because it considered the gain-of-function research too risky. Too risky for DARPA, perhaps, but not too risky for Dr. Fauci. As Vanity Fair reported in October of 2021, one distinctive segment of SARS-CoV-2's genetic code is a furin cleavage site that makes the virus more infectious by allowing it to efficiently enter human cells. Jamie Metzel, a former executive vice president of the Asia Society and member of the World Health Organization's Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, found the coincidence just a little too strange, observing, if I applied for funding to paint Central Park purple and was denied, but then a year later we woke up to find Central Park painted purple, I'd be a prime suspect. That grant proposal was uncovered by a group of independent journalists who call themselves Drastic, the decentralized radical autonomous search team investigating COVID-19. Gilles Dumaneuf, a data scientist from New Zealand and member of the Drastic Coalition, summed up the opinion of so many who have followed Dr. Fauci's dissembling. I cannot be sure, he said, that the pandemic originated from a research-related accident or infection from a sampling trip. But I am 100% sure that there was a massive cover-up.
New virus, never been seen before.
Escalated into an unprecedented outbreak. Contain the outbreak.
It's described as apocalyptic.
The virus is still moving fast across the globe.
You can hear the screams.
Incrementally getting more terrifying.
A quarter have tested positive.
194 new cases today alone.
It's on the verge of declaring a state of emergency.
Every bed is basically filled. I want to mention that makeshift morgue. It's here.
Passengers are quarantined.
So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, so it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science.
We need to see people suffering from this disease.
The policies we have all lived under for 2 years now have reordered our society and damaged our lives. In practice, these policies have meant bankruptcy, stagnation, and isolation.
Everything I own is being taken away from me.
Over the past 2 years, we have seen an enormous increase in anxiety and depression, particularly among young people, in drug overdoses, and in suicide.
Since the pandemic began, new encampments are popping up all across.
We've had to live under these policies, we are told, because we must follow the science. And the science, we are told, has a face. The face of Dr. Anthony Fauci.
The confines of transmissibility now going to be loosening up and broadening up.
In essence, AIDS is a difficult disease to catch.
You can't isolate yourself from the rest of the world for the whole flu season.
I would like to see a dramatic diminution of the personal interaction that we see. Whatever it takes to do that, that's what I'd like to see.
Although Dr. Fauci would go on to become the leading voice for alarm amid the pandemic, in the early days of COVID, Dr. Fauci downplayed the threat.
Bottom line, we don't have to worry about this one, right?
This is not something that the citizens of the United States right now should be worried about.
In an interview with the editorial board of USA Today, Dr. Fauci called the threat from the virus minuscule.
I don't think people should be frightened. I mean, the risk right now, today, currently, is really relatively low for the American public.
He mocked people who are worrying about going to a Chinese restaurant and insisted that the real threat that season came not from the new virus surging in China, but from the flu.
Be more concerned about influenza, which is going into a second peak for this season, than coronavirus, but
Fauci showed particular scorn for the trend then beginning to take off of wearing face masks in public.
People wearing masks now is just not relevant. You don't need to be walking around with a mask right now. Masks, quite frankly, are more important for people who are infected to prevent them from infecting someone else.
If you look at the masks that you buy in a drugstore, Fauci observed, the leakage around them doesn't really do much to protect you. People start saying, should I start wearing a mask? Now, in the United States, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to wear a mask. Fauci reiterated his discouragement of the masks during an interview with 60 Minutes on March 8th.
There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. Wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
I've worked with Tony Fauci during the Ebola crisis, and I think he's probably the most reliable, credible person right now in the federal government. So I listened to virtually everything he said.
No, I didn't listen to anybody but Fauci.
I'm a Fauci groupie. I'm a thrice vaccinated mask adherent.
When Fauci spoke, people listened. Democrat Congressman Eric Swalwell quickly began parroting Fauci's line. Stop wearing face masks, he urged his constituents on Twitter. The Surgeon General of the United States followed suit. Seriously, people, Jerome Adams inveighed. Stop buying masks.
Masks do not work for the general public in preventing them from getting coronavirus.
Right, and elbow.
But then, a month later, something strange happened. They all changed their minds. On April 3rd, the Surgeon General encouraged people to wear cloth face coverings in public settings where other social distancing measures are
difficult to maintain.
What had changed? Surgeon General Adams couldn't quite say, explaining away the change of heart as simply data-driven.
But I think on top of it, there's a moral reason that wearing a mask is our way of showing that we respect one another, that we care about one another.
Swalwell reversed course too, as did Dr. Fauci.
There should be universal wearing of masks. There should be, to the extent possible, social distancing, avoiding crowds. Outdoors always better than indoors.
But the science and the data that Fauci and the others invoked to justify their reversal had not changed much over the intervening weeks. In fact, the CDC published a paper the following month declaring that more than a dozen randomized controlled trials of cloth masks did not support a substantial effect on transmission of viruses. Many months after that, still more studies raised serious doubts about the efficacy of masks in preventing coronavirus infection.
Because your mask doesn't protect you, it protects me. I wear my mask to protect you. Mask up, America.
As the United States closed in on the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of the COVID pandemic, CNN medical analyst Liana Wen admitted on television that cloth masks are
little more than facial decorations. There's no place for them in light of Omicron.
We can leave it to more qualified experts to debate the medical efficacy of face coverings. That Dr. Fauci would publicly hold contradictory sides of an important issue in such a short period of time calls into serious question both his judgment and competence. But even more disturbing than his flip-flop, and even more relevant for our look into Fauci's ethics, is the reason he gave for the flip-flop.
The critical issue was to save the masks for the people who really needed them, because it was felt that there was a shortage of masks.
In other words, Fauci based his advice not on his scientific opinion, but on his political preferences. Fauci did in fact believe that the masks would provide protection to people in the middle of the outbreak, but he wanted to save the masks for healthcare workers.
We were afraid that that would deter away from the people who really needed it.
So he lied to the public about his actual views regarding the efficacy of masks. Then, when the much-feared mask shortage never materialized, Fauci flipped his position and told the public what he really thought, the deceit being a sort of noble lie for the greater good. According to Dr. Fauci, his desired ends justified his dishonest means. In Fauci's own telling, it was politics, not science, that dictated his early mask policy, just as it was politics that dictated so many of his positions over the years. No scientific breakthrough on the efficacy of face masks took place in the month between Fauci's first stance and his flip-flop. The only thing that changed was the politics, and yet Fauci couldn't bring himself to admit it.
For goodness sakes, I've never had any political ideology that I've made public. I'm really just talking to you about public health. When I'm telling you wear a mask, keep social distancing, avoid crowds, there's nothing political about that. That's a public health message that we know works.
Whatever Dr. Fauci's expertise in epidemiology, with that exasperated plea, he proved he didn't understand the first thing about political philosophy. How could there be nothing political about public policy? Policy that affects hundreds of millions of people in the United States and many more around the world.
I don't know what I'm saying that people don't get. This is not a joke, and I am not kidding.
The words public and political are synonyms. They mean the same thing. Public health has a scientific aspect, of course, but it has a political aspect too. Dr. Fauci works for the government. His job is to craft government policy and make political decisions. He insists that what he does is merely push policies that work, but in order for something to work, it must have a purpose. A clock works when it tells time. A telephone works when it makes calls. And public policy works when it achieves its goals. But who determines what those goals should be? According to the traditional American concept of self-government, we the people determine those goals within the boundaries set by the Constitution. According to the newer, progressive conception of government, those goals are determined by a handful of largely unaccountable bureaucrats and scientific experts, whom the people are expected simply to follow.
We can halt the chain of transmission. We can do something if we unify together, and we can halt this in just a matter of a couple of weeks.
Many Americans have a natural affinity for self-government and a natural aversion to power-hungry bureaucrats. But there's another reason to distrust this top-down form of government. which Dr. Fauci illustrated again and again throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the strongest arguments against an oligarchy of scientific experts is that the experts often aren't all that expert. Everyone remembers Dr. Fauci's flip-flop on the masks, but fewer people remember that he flipped on the issue not once, but twice. On January 25th, 2021, Dr. Fauci was asked whether people should consider wearing 2 masks at the same time to reduce their chances of being infected with COVID. Fauci responded in the affirmative.
Do you believe that that's advisable and makes a difference?
You know, it likely does, because, I mean, this is a physical covering to prevent droplets and virus to get in. So if you have a physical covering with one layer, you put another layer on, it just makes common sense that it likely would be more effective. And that's the reason.
Now, common sense is all well and good, but it isn't a particularly scientific term. And Fauci began to be criticized for making a scientific claim without any scientific evidence. So a week later, in yet another TV interview, Fauci reversed his position.
There are many people who feel, you know, if you really want to have an extra little bit of protection, maybe I should put 2 masks on. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's no data that indicates that that is going to make a difference, and that's the reason.
Regardless of what one thinks about the masks, Fauci's constant flip-flopping did not instill confidence, and the contradictions extended far beyond the masks. In June of 2020, Fauci claimed to have been always saying that a respiratory illness like COVID-19 would be his worst nightmare. But if this sort of illness was always his worst nightmare, then how come he told the American public that the risk from the virus was minuscule just a few months earlier?
The risk right now is really relatively low.
How about lockdowns? On January 24th, 2020, Fauci was asked whether the United States would consider a lockdown policy to stop the spread of the virus. Fauci answered with an emphatic no. He considered it unthinkable.
I don't think we possibly could do in the United States. I can't imagine shutting down New York or Los Angeles.
The issue wasn't merely one of impracticability. Fauci also believed that lockdowns wouldn't serve any medical purpose.
Historically, when you shut things down, it doesn't necessarily have a major effect.
The dismissal of lockdowns was consistent with Dr. Fauci's earlier policy recommendations during the Ebola scare of 2014.
Doing mandatory quarantines, good idea?
We have to be careful that there are unintended consequences. There are other ways to protect. There's monitoring, there's direct monitoring, there's active monitoring. We don't necessarily need to do that.
So how did we end up with years-long lockdowns? Well, as usual, Fauci flip-flopped. By March of 2020, less than 2 months after dismissing the prospect of lockdowns, Fauci endorsed them.
If you look at the curves of outbreaks, you know, they go big peaks and they come down. What we need to do is flatten that down.
Flatten the curve.
Flatten the curve.
If we're able to flatten the curve.
When you see that beautiful curve that you're trying to flatten all the time.
The phrase flatten the curve.
Flattening the curve.
That curve is flattening because we are flattening.
Fauci had embraced a doomsday prophecy of COVID death put together by Neil Ferguson, an epidemiologist at Imperial College London. The model predicted the imminent death of over 2 million Americans from the coronavirus. Soon, lockdowns swept the nation, with 43 out of 50 states issuing some form of shelter-in-place ordinances. The problem with Fauci's favored model is that it was completely bogus, as researchers discovered a couple of months later. According to one computer data modeling expert quoted in the Daily Telegraph, the model was a buggy mess that looks more like a bowl of angel hair pasta than a finely tuned piece of programming. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh attempted to replicate Ferguson's findings. Not only did the data give the team different results when they used different machines to replicate the model, the team got different results even when they used the same machines. As the researchers wrote, there appears to be a bug in either the creation or reuse of the network file. If we attempt 2 completely identical runs, only varying in that the second should use the network file produced by the first, the results are quite different. The negligence of Ferguson, and of Fauci, who embraced the bogus model, was stunning. In the words of Oxford professor Michael Bonsall, models must be capable of passing the basic scientific test of producing the same results given the same initial set of parameters. Otherwise, there is simply no way of knowing whether they will be reliable. So on Fauci's recommendation, based on a worthless computer model, the United States went into lockdown for no reason, despite a substantial body of epidemiological literature that strongly condemned lockdowns.
Now the latest CDC report shows higher numbers of people are in mental health crisis and thinking about suicide alongside the pandemic.
Turned himself in on charges of unlawful assembly and violating public health emergency rules of
the mortuary service that they had put together for friends and family had to be canceled. The only thing that we could offer them was a direct burial and a direct cremation with only one person in attendance.
Hayden hanged himself in his room just days before his 13th birthday.
I tried to save him and I failed, I wasn't able to, and it weighs heavy on me. Well, we were seeing increased anxiety from the pandemic, and that was clear. He wanted to play football. He wanted to see his friends. He hated online schooling. Some kids would love it. My son hated it.
The sheer incompetence would have justified Fauci's ouster from his perch of influence. Even if the policy had simply not helped, it is hard to imagine how the flub would not have justified Fauci's firing. But as research soon showed, the lockdowns did not merely not help. They actively harmed the public health. In early 2022, a meta-analysis of 34 qualified studies out of Johns Hopkins University concluded that the lockdowns had little to no effect on COVID-19 mortality, but imposed enormous economic and social costs and contributed to reducing economic activity, raising unemployment, reducing schooling, causing political unrest, contributing to domestic violence, and undermining liberal democracy.
We look at all the evidence, and we find that the average lockdown in Europe and United States only reduced mortality by 0.2%.
The predicted mass casualties never materialized. A U.S. Navy hospital ship sent to relieve overcrowded hospitals in New York ended up setting sail again after just 1 month, having served only 182 patients. An emergency hospital set up in Manhattan's Javits Center remained mostly empty. Yet despite such consistently wrong promises and predictions, the draconian public health measures remained in place.
When we first closed, it didn't even enter our mind that we wouldn't be reopening.
At first, Fauci opposed the lockdowns as impractical and ill-advised. Then, he endorsed 15 days of lockdowns to flatten the curve of the virus. These couple of weeks soon morphed into months, and even years. First to slow the spread, then to find a cure, then to take the jab, then back to stopping the surge after the vaccines failed to stop infection and transmission, and then finally they just simply continued.
I believe we'll start to see much more being open about indoor situations, be they theaters, be they restaurants, be they schools, be they workplaces. That doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly the way it was 3 or 4 years ago.
It's not vaccines instead of masks. It's not vaccines instead of distancing. Do it all.
The find a cure stage of the COVID response offers a telling look into Fauci's competence and ethics, since he appears to have gotten it wrong, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, at each and every step of the way. In March of 2020, Dr. Fauci proclaimed that the development of a COVID vaccine
is going to take a year and a half at least.
Pfizer identified a vaccine 4 months later, signed a contract for 100 million doses with the federal government later that month, and submitted the vaccine to the FDA for emergency authorization just 4 months after that. So much for at least a year to a year and a half away. And Dr. Fauci's misinformation regarding the vaccines and herd immunity only got worse from there. Throughout most of 2020, Dr. Fauci claimed that 60 to 70% of people would need to become immune to COVID, either through infection or vaccination, in order to reach herd immunity. Then, in November, Fauci shifted that number up.
The estimate is that you'll need about 70%, maybe 75% of the people in the country vaccinating.
A month after that, Fauci exaggerated the number to
between 75 and 85% of the population.
When called out on the inconsistency, Fauci admitted that he had no idea what the actual percentage necessary to attain herd immunity was.
Why weren't you straight with the American people about this to begin with?
No, actually, Dana, I don't think it could be interpreted as being straight or not. We have to realize that we have to be humble and realize what we don't know.
He simply hoped to nudge more people into taking the vaccine by making up higher and higher numbers. Fauci seems to have justified this unscientific, not to mention unethical, approach to public health messaging on the grounds that the vaccine would stop the pandemic. According to Dr. Fauci, vaccinated people could not contract or spread COVID-19. So once enough people got the shot, COVID would be a thing of the past, as Fauci, along with CDC Director Rochelle Walensky and others, promised in interview after interview.
The vaccines are highly effective.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
Vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick.
Everyone who takes the vaccine is not just protecting themselves, but reducing their transmission.
Unfortunately, vaccinated people did in fact contract the coronavirus. At first, Fauci and the other public health authorities dismissed these infections as mere breakthrough cases. But eventually, so many cases broke through that they had to admit the truth. The vaccines did not stop infection or transmission. In fact, vaccinated people were observed to carry the same amount of virus as unvaccinated people.
Our vaccines are working exceptionally well, but what they can't do anymore is prevent transmission.
We got vaccines that help you with your health, but they only slightly reduce the transmissions.
Reports from our international colleagues suggest increased risk of severe disease amongst those vaccinated early.
Given Fauci's befuddlement over how to stop the virus, it comes as no surprise that his narrative regarding the virus's origins soon fell apart too. In May of 2020, Dr. Fauci claimed in an interview with National Geographic that the virus
could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated.
That is, the virus must have arisen totally in nature. In October of 2020, Dr. Fauci went even further, that it would be molecularly impossible for COVID-19 to have leaked from a laboratory.
The viruses that were discussed, including the viruses that Senator Paul mentioned, would be molecularly impossible to have resulted in SARS-CoV-2.
Then, a trove of Dr. Fauci's personal emails later revealed that all the way back in January of 2020, a virologist from the Scripps Research Institute emailed Fauci to inform him that some of the virus's features looked engineered, that the genome is inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory, meaning that a natural origin of the virus seemed implausible. As the evidence pointing to a laboratory origin of the virus continued to mount, in May of 2021, Fauci finally flip-flopped on his claims of a natural origin. When asked by Katie Sanders of PolitiFact whether he remained confident that it developed naturally, Fauci responded,
"No, I'm not convinced about that. I think
that same month, Fauci refused to rule out a laboratory origin of the virus during Senate testimony. When asked by Senator Rand Paul,
"Will you, in front of this group, categorically say that the COVID-19 could not have occurred through serial passage in a laboratory?"
Fauci responded,
"I do not have any accounting of what the Chinese may have done, and I'm fully in favor of any further investigation of what went on in China. However, I will repeat again, the NIH and NIAID categorically has not funded gain-of-function research to be conducted in the Wuhan Institute of Virology."
As we outlined in the second part of this series, Fauci's agency did in fact fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute, We have the grant approval documents to prove it. But more relevant to this discussion is Fauci's shift on COVID's origins. First, he claimed a laboratory origin was molecularly impossible. Then he was not convinced it didn't originate in a lab. Then he did not have any accounting of what the Chinese may have done, and therefore favored further investigation of what went on in China. Then, just a couple weeks after casting doubt on the virus's natural origin, he flip-flopped again, telling CBS News that he remained confident that COVID-19 developed naturally.
If you said, I think it's possible that COVID-19 came from a lab, you'd be banned from many social media platforms. Now, that's on the cover of Newsweek.
The deceits, the feints, the plain old mistakes of America's highest paid federal employee are dizzying. The confusion appears almost to be by design, a political strategy of obfuscation, whereby Dr. Fauci can never be proven right or wrong because he's held every side of every question. A strategy aided by institutional support at the NIH, which has stopped responding to our producers' requests for documents. Support in the media, through which Fauci has cultivated his finely tuned public persona. And support throughout the political establishment, which has backed the charming and disarming bureaucrat at every turn.
The major platforms have a responsibility related to the health and safety of all Americans to stop amplifying untrustworthy content.
People who feel differently, who have conspiracy theories, who deny reality that's looking them straight in the eye, those are people that don't particularly care for me. And sometimes the truth becomes inconvenient for some people, so they react against me.
For nearly 40 years, Anthony Fauci has managed to stay one step ahead of his critics.
Don't you think it's time that you step down and let
Like Tony Fauci does not mind going on television in front of the people that pay his salary and lie directly into the camera.
Flitting from failure to failure, all the while growing his fame, wealth, and power. When asked if she could imagine any circumstance in which Joe Biden, the 7th president under which Fauci has held power, would fire the public health guru, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki responded flatly,
no.
During his time as a public servant, Fauci has amassed a fortune, at least $10.4 million as of 2022, according to financial disclosures. And he has become a household name, a ubiquitous presence on television news shows.
And to the real Dr. Fauci, thank you for your calm and your clarity in this unnerving time.
The best scientists may stay in the labs. The best politicians end up in government. And the best politicians of all rule without their subjects even noticing. With more eyes than ever on Dr. Fauci, his 4-decade reign at the top of America's public health hierarchy may be coming to an end. But if past is precedent, Fauci may outfox his opponents yet again.
The idea that you can get up here and talk about what you know, what the evidence, what the science is, and know that's it. Let the science speak. It is somewhat of a liberating feeling.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci, so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we'll have him back again. So.